tens of thousands of dollars with the expectation that upon graduation, you'll be able to find a job to pay back those loans, your parents, your caregivers, etc. Right? And because of our unwavering, but also our wavering belief in the American dream. And the irony is that the more we start questioning the American dream, the more we seem to actually invest in education, the more we seem to reinvest in the traditional ways of how folks get upward mobility. So what do I mean? What does this look like? Simply stated, if there's a laser here, the top line here is people who have a terminal degree, PhD, JD, MD, etc., and their average salary is $98,000 per year. For those folks who have less than a high school diploma, their average salary is $23,000 per year. Two other things that you should notice is that in the past 30 years, the sort of constant dollars of those folks without a high school diploma, their actual buying power has dropped, right? From $30,000 to $23,000. Whereas those folks with advanced degrees, it seems like anyway, at least their wages have stayed constant or have risen. Same sort of graph that we sort of expect lifetime earnings, that there's a correlation between academic achievement, academic attainment, and income. Well, we sort of buy into that idea that there's a correlation between those. Now, what's funny about this graph is it starts to already disrupt those ideas, that we start taking into context things like gender. We start seeing that there's great discrepancies. And in fact, the more education you receive, the higher the pay discrepancy is amongst gender, right? It's almost counterintuitive. And the same thing we're sort of breaking down by race. We can do these around notions of religion, we can do it around notions of language, we can find ways in which we sort of think that getting a college degree is going to somehow return something to us. And so that's sort of asking me, or making me ask the question, why am I buying into college? What was my collegiate experience? And more importantly, why are colleges and universities constantly trying to recruit me, or people who look like me, as being diverse, right? This coincides with American demographics. American demographics seem to be in a shift, and that we start seeing that there's a decline of the white population, an increase in Latino population, a relative stagnation in the black population, and an increase in Asian American folk. One wonders what we talk about, at least when we spend time to discuss indigenous folks. But as this chart seems to indicate, they don't even make the list, right? So it gives us some indication of what we think about the way in which folks are raced. This has led us to think all kinds of things. How many of you have heard, by show of hands, by the year 2050, white folks will be the minority? Has anyone heard that quote before? It's an absolute bull-faced lie, right? You can see it here. In other words, white folks will still be the single largest majority ethnic group. And to assume that Latino folk and black folk and Asian folk and indigenous folks think alike, or act alike, or have shared politics is a misnomer, right? So white folks will still be the majority, but it doesn't stop us from having scare tactics, right? It doesn't stop us from scaring the sort of impending browning of America, that race is coming to get us, that in many regards we've already associated diversity with some form of death, right? This is not necessarily a new idea. Now, what's interesting to me is when I look at sort of the declining rates of white folks in the country, it does not hold true on institutions of higher education. In fact, institutions of higher education are historically overrepresented by the white population. And this is probably a good time for me to say that while our comments today, or my comments in particular today, are raced, or using a race framework, that in our center we try to do as good of a job as we can about this idea of intersectionality. So thinking about these ideas in terms of not just race, but race and gender, race and class, race and sexuality, race and religion, right? So I'm coming at you today from a raced framework, but it's also going to be much more expansive to how some of these other ideas play themselves out. SUNY Cortland, these are SUNY Cortland's demographics, by the way, and I'm doing it for a particular reason. They're not that much dissimilar from Ithaca colleges or any other institution of higher education I see across the country. This number has been interesting to me, that 13.1% of SUNY Cortland students choose not to identify. And I would dare say that that is not 13.1% additional folks of color. I've been on your campus, I've seen who's around, right? That it looks to be roughly an 80 or 90% white campus, much like my campus is. And we should ask ourselves the reason why I would project that more and more folks are choosing not to identify is because of the erroneous beliefs that we have about affirmative action. That somehow we think if I mark down that I'm white, I get punished. And if I mark down that I'm black, Asian, Latino, or indigenous, that somehow I get an advantage. And if that's still the case, if affirmative action is so successful in giving folks an advantage, then I'm still wondering why white folks are overrepresented, right? So I'm wondering about this disadvantage-advantage thing. But let's be real, when we talk about notions of diversity, really what we're trying to talk about, in many regards, is race. And not that diversity only means race, it needs to be much more expansive. but we know that diversity is code word for race. So how do we visually try to depict what a diverse campus looks like? I spent 5 minutes going onto your campus. I spent a couple hours on your campus website. I spent 5 minutes trying to pick out some pictures when you just go to cortland.edu of what is shown. This is the first picture I was shown. Makes sense, it's lacrosse season. The second picture I was shown. And then in the you can't make this up category. The next picture. The next picture. The next picture. The next picture. So while black and brown and Asian students make up less than 25% of the population, they seem to be over 70% of at least your website homepage as the clicker feeds, right? Diversity is code word for race, whether we want it to be or not, or that's its origins. But it also seems to indicate that we have what I call a definitional challenge. That diversity provides us with a definitional challenge, that we don't know how to define it. And so one of my things as a researcher was trying to research various definitions of diversity. How are institutions of higher education identifying who was within the diversity framework? Who falls in this umbrella? As I'm sure you can imagine, there's a great deal of folks who fall within this category. Now I'm going to make an argument about some of these categories momentarily, but I want to pause for a second and say that when I talk about notions of diversity, what I'm most interested is in diversity that is attached to power and consequence. And I'm going to give you an example. There's been a couple of major motion pictures talking about sexism in the workplace. And shouldn't it surprise us that almost all those major motion picture films feature women bosses and male subordinates, which is not the way in which it usually plays out, right? That in the form of patriarchy and sexism, it's oftentimes men enforcing their sexism and patriarchy on women. And the same thing sort of happens here, that when I talk about race, I'm interested in consequence. I'm interested in power. So I'm interested in the way in which we talk about diversity that actually has something attached to it. Another example. On my campus a couple of years ago, we had a diversity campaign that was called I Am Diverse. And it had posters of folks all across campus, including our college president. And it had a picture of them with the words I am diverse, and then sort of discussed why they were diverse. And in one of the posters, one of the people were diverse because they collect baseball cards, right? Or because they were left-handed. And I was trying to say there's no consequence to those things. Now, it's not like you can't find a right-handed desk, I understand that, right? But laws and procedures weren't put in place to make sure that left-handed folk in particular, right, or folks who collect baseball cards, couldn't go to college, couldn't own property, couldn't get money, right? So for me, there has to be consequence. We have to acknowledge power. And so what takes place is that we've tried to find ways in which to define diversity to be all things to all people. And in doing so, we've actually made diversity into nothing. I hope that makes sense, right? You can't be everything and something at the same time. We have to reserve some of these aspects for positions of power, for consequence, for the way in which we oppress folks. And so things like ability, things like language, things like religion, sexuality absolutely must be included on the diversity umbrella. But as we keep expanding and expanding it, we don't know how to define it. If we don't know how to define it, then we don't know what to do with it, right? So what do we do with it? I'm reminded of my 10th grade honors English teacher, Miss Catrini, who would always tell me how bad my writing was. In fact, I think her word was, my writing was trite, in big red marker, right? But she would always tell me to look for the is in a statement. Where is the noun? So as I go through and try to find diversity statements, what is the is? Diversity is an ability. It's a variety. It's a strength. It's an asset. It's a commitment. It's an opportunity. It's a way of thinking. It's a reality. It's a process. We can go on and on and on. I'm not taking issue with any one of these. I'm taking issue with all of them, right? That at some point in time, it's got to be something a little bit more concrete than just sort of this constant running things about whatever we want it to be. Since I do work on policy, what do we do with diversity? We value it. We promote it. We celebrate it. We affirm it. We protect it. We believe it. We increase it. We try to achieve it. Or as one of my students at one point in time said, why is it that diversity is something that only students of color can be or achieve? Right? So I'm interested in this idea that it seems like we don't know how to define it. It seems like we don't know what to do with it. And those ways and those measures, what diversity seems to mean to me, is nothing more than a form of tokenism. I want your picture on my brochure. I want your picture on my website. But I do not want to fundamentally change the structure of how my institution operates.
Wow.
I don't want to make room for your culture to actually be affirmed. I don't want to make room for your ways of being, thinking, and just living in the world to actually be relevant what I want to do is to have you come and be a nice face for a photo op. Now, what did that mean for me and my educational experience? It clearly meant that my job at the University of Rochester was not to go there to get educated. My job was to educate white students. That was my role. I was let into that institution. I didn't earn my right of court affirmative action, right? I was somehow let in. I was not, what's the word I'm looking for? I was not meritorious. I was undeserving somehow of being in that spot. And therefore, my recourse, my response was to spend most of my days and most of my classes as one of the few folks of color, if not the only folk of color in my classes, constantly teaching white folks about the black experience, right? That was my role. And what I'm saying in that regard is if we practice diversity that way, that for me, that diversity equals racism. It's a reinforcement of racism. It does nothing to help me, my family, my community. It does much more to help the majority population, much more to affirm their existence and give them some taste of city life, or some taste of an urban experience, or some taste of Latinos, but no real shift, right? No fundamental shift. And so that's partly what I'm talking about, that I define diversity as a form of racism. Now let me back up real quick if I can and give you, I think in mathematical terms. I went to college to be an engineer, summarily flunked out of college, and went back to be a political scientist and then do some notions of policy. But I think in math terms, and I think in large part comes from my family. So I want to share with you a couple of ways in which I come by this by giving you some mathematical folk wisdoms. Now these are things my father would say to me growing up that I tried to turn into mathematical equations, right? So the first one, a mathematical equation that my father would say to me as he handed me my allowance every week, which wasn't much, but I was thankful for it. And the saying was, spend it fast or spend it slow, but when it's gone, there ain't no more. Right. Another one. Right, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. Which was an absolute bull-faced lie. Many of you all know it, right? It was an absolute bull-faced lie. Or what I think well, my father's best one and my mother, the best one to me was this idea, right? That I have to be twice as good to get half the chance, right? American forms of meritocracy, right? That become racialized, that become gendered, that become sexualized. The ways in which this notion is that somehow I'm always less than and I got to work twice as hard, right? And so when I say about things like diversity equals racism, I'm really thinking about these terms in sort of mathematical ways. That's how my mind works in some regards. Now, it's somewhat unfair for me to say to you that diversity equals racism without also giving you my definition of racism. And so students in my class struggle with a couple of my definitions of racism, and I'm particularly fond of two definitions of racism. One is by Leonard Harris, and he says that racism is a polymorphous agent of death, premature births, shortened lives, starving children, debilitating theft, abusive larceny, degrading results, and insulting stereotypes forcibly imposed. Right. And then by Ruthie Gilmore, racism is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So we spend time in my class talking about the way in which racism, like all forms of ism, try to not only dehumanize, but shorten people's lives. Right? If we look at life expectancy rates, we find that there's a clear difference by race. We find incarceration rates, we find there's a clear difference by race. HIV rates, a clear difference by race. Educational attainment, net wealth. We can go on down the line that seems that race structures people's life chances. And therefore, I spend my time going to the end result, which for my students, they become very keen on saying racism is a polymorphous agent of death. Right? So I define racism as death. That's what we spend some time in my classes doing for 5, 10, 30 weeks. So if I use the math wisdom for diversity, including the actual substitution property for equality, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. If diversity equals racism and racism equals death, then diversity equals death. Diversity kills. Takes years off my life. Adds to my hypertension, adds to blood pressure, adds to the fact that I feel like I constantly have to sort of negotiate majority white spaces, and how that adds additional stress to my living and literally shortens my life. That's the part that I've been trying to think about. Right? That's the thesis that I've been playing around with. That on one hand, the promise of diversity is that we can actually change the world, share with one another, explore one another. The flip side is that it kills people. It takes time off their lives. Now, we were fortunate last semester, earlier in the semester, to have a group by the name of Rebel Diaz come visit us.